All right, this is going to be somewhat of a review, some new terminology, and some just adding on some things you've done before. And I want to start just by showing an example, and this will help lead into what's called multiplicity. So this is 95% of your work, what we're doing here, and then we're going to learn about multiplicity. But multiplicity is going to come after I do a couple examples here. Example 1, find all zeros. All right, so I'm saying find all zeros. I'm asking you to do something that we haven't even talked about. What are zeros? That should be what you're thinking. What does it mean, find all zeros? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We already know how to do it. Zeros means x-intercepts. So whenever you see find all zeros, it's referring to x-intercepts. So keep that in mind. You'll start seeing zeros, find all zeros a lot more often. All right, and let's look at something like this. That's a polynomial function, not a quadratic like we've been looking at. X cubed plus 3x squared minus x minus 3. So I want you to just pause, sit and think about how to do this, how to work it. This is something that we haven't looked at in a while, and see what you think. All right, how you work this one is by factor by grouping. Here's my first group, here's my second group. So what does my first group have in common? This is group 1. What does it have in common? They both have an x squared. So I'm going to factor out an x squared. So this is equal to x squared. When I take an x squared out of this x cubed, I'm left with x, and then plus 3. Now in group 2, I need to factor something out also. Now keep in mind, when we do factor by grouping, we want whatever's inside of these parentheses to be the same. Once we make those the same, then we're finished. We're not finished, but we're on the right path to get the correct answer. So notice here that both of these, x and 3, are positive. This x and 3 are negative, but they both have a negative in common, so we can factor out a negative 1. So minus 1, you don't necessarily have to write the 1. Now open a parenthesis. When you take a negative out of negative x, you're left with x. When you take a negative out of negative 3, it's a positive 3. So now our parentheses are the same. So that's one factor. So we can write that x plus 3. And what's left over, this x squared and minus 1 is our other factor. X squared minus 1. And I should have did this at the beginning. This is my fault. When we're finding all zeros, that means set it equal to 0. So this should be equal to 0. I'm going to erase these equal signs. Too many equal signs. You don't want them on both sides. Equals 0. Equals 0. So not a big hiccup there, but we need it. All right, now that we have factored these two things successfully, we can break them up into two different ones and set them as separately equal to 0. So x plus 3 is equal to 0, and x squared minus 1 is equal to 0. Over here on the left, you get x is equal to negative 3, which, remember, when we're dealing with zeros, I'm saying zeros instead of x-intercepts. When we're dealing with zeros, it's a point. So this is negative 3 comma 0. And then on the right, to get x by itself, we add 1 to both sides. So we get x squared is equal to 1. And so we have to square root both sides. And you get not x equals to 1, but x equals to plus or minus 1. Remember, when you introduce a square root, you always have to count for the plus or minus. Because if you plug in 1 here for x squared, you get 1. If you plug in negative 1 x squared, it's negative 1 times negative 1, which is still positive 1. So x is equal to plus or minus 1. Sorry, I'm getting kind of low down there. So you get 1 comma 0 and negative 1 comma 0. So I know what my answer is. All right, so that's finding zeros. Let's look at one more here. Didn't save myself a lot of room. B, g of x equals x to the 4th minus 4x cubed plus 4x squared. All right. Try to pause the video and give this one a try. At least think about it for a little bit. All right. So first, we need to set this thing equal to 0. And we need to recognize that we can't use the AC method here. We can't use factor by grouping. But what do we notice? We notice that, well, each term, the 3 terms have an x squared in common. So we could factor out an x squared. So x squared, take an x squared out of x to the 4th, you get x squared minus 4x, and then plus 4. All right, if you're unsure if you did that correct, how can you check yourself? Take this x squared and multiply it back into each of these terms, and you should wind up with what you started with. And we're well on our way. So there's 2 different ways you can go about doing this right now. You can go ahead and separate them into 2 and set them separately equal to 0. Or you go ahead and recognize that this is AC method and you can do the AC method now. I'm just going to go ahead and separate them. Both ways are perfectly fine. And in fact, I'm not going to here because when we get to multiplicity section, it will be important to not separate them yet. It'll make life a little bit easier. So x squared, and then when I do the AC method on this, I will wind up getting x minus 2 times x minus 2 is equal to 0. All right, I didn't separate them out. I just did side work to do the AC method on this portion. I just kept them together. And that's just something as you work problems you'll pick up on. And when we get to the multiplicity section, you'll understand why. So here, notice I have 2 x minus 2's, so I've got x squared, and then when you're multiplying 2 things together, it becomes squared. And if you did break them out, like I did at first, it's okay. You can still wind up with the same answer. Just visually, when you're first learning multiplicity, it's good for me to have it shown you like this. Now you can break them out into 2. X squared is equal to 0, and x minus 2 squared is equal to 0. So square root both sides here. The square root of 0 is 0, so x is equal to 0. And then over here, the square root both sides, the square root of 0 is 0. So x minus 2 is equal to 0, and x is equal to 2. So you have a point 0, 0, and 2 comma 0. All right, now we're going to get in, now that we kind of got a handle on this, we're going to get into multiplicity in the next lecture.